Hi everyone, we're back. After fighting a long and costly war, we now need to turn to understanding how this new nation of the United States is going to build itself during this time period. Now, very early on, despite all the rhetoric of the revolution concerning democracy and one man, one vote, the idea that the people's voice should be heard in government, despite all that rhetoric, actually when the former colonies, now states, sit down to start writing their state-level constitutions, almost immediately you're going to see them placing restrictions on who can and cannot participate in their new government. For example, to be able to vote in the new state of Maryland, according to their constitution, adult white males had to own at least 50 acres of land or have property worth 30 pounds sterling, a barrier to about 1/3 of potential voters. And in Maryland, a candidate for governor had to be worth at least 5,000 pounds sterling. That was an enormous sum that would have prevented almost everyone in that state, with the exception of a handful of people, from running for the office of governor. As you can see, Benjamin Franklin is critical, as you would expect, offering the analogy that, if someone owns a piece of property worth $50 and they're allowed to vote, but they lose that property before the next election, does that mean they can no longer vote? In other words, where does your right to vote stem from? Does it stem from you as a person, or does it stem from you merely owning property, which many people mistakenly believed during that time period meant that you were a qualified voter because you had some money behind you. Well, what we're going to see is these voting restrictions will be done away with in a generation or two after the American Revolution. People are going to be understandably upset that if they came from a poor background, they had laid their lives on the line just like their wealthier counterparts, but now they had no political voice. They're going to fight back against this, as you might imagine, through legal means, and we will gradually see by the 1810s, the 1820s, that most states will do away with the property holding requirement. Yet while the vote is being offered to adult white men, it still excluded women. Native Americans also could not vote, and of course slaves were also not allowed to cast their ballots. All right, now, mentioning slavery, I do want to talk very briefly about a trend that will start to take place in the northern states after the Revolutionary War. We will begin to see many of these northern states outlawing slavery. All right, they will start to ban slavery in places like Pennsylvania in 1780. Or Massachusetts by 1783. Now, some of this will be due to many slaveholders realizing the hypocrisy that they had been practicing in recent years, claiming that they were slaves to Great Britain while they were holding other human beings in bondage. And so we're going to begin to see slavery being phased out in the northern states. However, in the southern states, we will see they're going to double down on slavery. All right, so we will not see a nationwide liberation of slaves, only in the northern states. And this is going to lead to some tensions developing between the now free states, as they become known, in the northeast, and the slave states in the south. Right, now that we've spent a few minutes talking about state-level governments and voting restrictions and certain states that will begin to outlaw slavery, we need to turn to what this new country's national government will look like. The very first government of the United States will be based upon the Articles of Confederation. And this will be a very loose agreement that will be crafted amongst the states, a loose confederation, hence the title of this document. A loose confederation of the states where the states have the majority of the power, not the federal government. And you need to understand that this was done very deliberately by the leaders during this period. They have just gotten done fighting a terrible long war against an unjust foreign power, and they want to make sure that the new government that comes out of the ashes of this long war will be one that respects the rights of the states, that respects the rights of individual citizens, and doesn't get too big over time and doesn't begin abusing the rights of the population. So the Articles of Confederation are deliberately created to fashion a very weak almost ineffectual central government and instead leave the majority of the decision making to the states. So among the many problems plaguing the Articles of Confederation will be a lack of executive and judicial branches. There will only be one branch of government under the Articles of Confederation, the legislative branch, and that will be run by the Congress of the Confederation. And in the Congress of the Confederation, each state gets exactly one vote. Now, that may sound very fair and equitable, but for the larger states within the Union, and by larger I mean population-wise, for states like Virginia, for instance, that have a population hovering around 600,000 individuals, they feel like it's unfair that they only have one vote. That, for example, they have the same voting power in this new Congress as Rhode Island, a state that has 1/10 of their population, only about 68,000 residents in that state. All right, so while some of the smaller states, like Rhode Island, are delighted to, have the exact same voting power as a New York or a Virginia, the larger states do not like the system. They feel like if this is a democracy, then states that have larger populations should have more voting power in this body. So that's one among many problems. You also have a very cumbersome, which is to say a very slow voting system that requires a 2/3 vote just to introduce any new bills within the body, and it requires a unanimous vote, all 13 states saying yes for this document to even be amended. So very, very slow, cumbersome. Another problem with the Articles of Confederation is the fact that this new government does not have the power to raise an armed force to defend the states against a foreign power. Instead, each state has to take care of their own business. So again, for some of the smaller states, in this way, it's a serious problem for them. And we'll talk more about that when we get to Shays Rebellion next. Also, this new federal government cannot levy taxes. Instead, it basically has to ask the states to contribute a certain amount of tax revenues each year. And the states are not willing to do that, as you might imagine. So this new government, in other words, is chronically starved for funds. Another problem is it cannot regulate commerce between the states. So you end up with a situation in which the states are very quickly turning on one another, and there is no authority figure to regulate these state-level disputes. A useful analogy might be, imagine a family with 13 kids. Okay, and each kid, as it grows older and it wants more responsibility, it wants more freedom, the parents basically can't control the kids. Each kid gets to decide for themselves when they go to bed. Each kid decides for themselves what they eat for dinner and when they go to school. Chaos, okay, confusing, bickering, and squabbling. So we're seeing with the Articles of Confederation some pretty serious issues coming up quickly. One incident that really begins to highlight one of the major weaknesses of this document is Shays Rebellion, in which you see a revolt of armed farmers in western Massachusetts who were very upset over a series of new taxes that their state is passing on them. If you can't pay your taxes during this time period, you might have your land taken away from you. Many of these farmers did. Or you might also be jailed for not paying taxes. This was also happening to some of these farmers. And so for them, many of these farmers had just participated in the American Revolution, and so they think, well, let's pick up some guns. Let's stage another revolt. The problem here is that, remember, there is no national, military force. The state of Massachusetts is responsible for putting down this rebellion. It just so happened that their governor, James Bowdoin, was a very wealthy individual who had several wealthy friends who were able to very quickly pull some money together and hire an armed militia to go into western Massachusetts and start putting down this rebellion. But what if they had not been able to do that? All right, so many other states start to kind of say, you know what, this whole business of each state having to take care of its own military business, that may leave us pretty vulnerable. For example, during Shays Rebellion, what if Britain had tried to come back and retake Massachusetts? While they were already occupied, trying to put out fires in their own backyard, what if that had happened? Or what if this rebellion had spread across state lines, and now you're talking about 3 or 4 states states that are having to deal with open rebellion. What if Britain or France or another colonial power had tried to come back and retake these states? They would have been left helpless and left to their own devices. So this will help kind of steer the states and many of their leaders towards maybe rethinking, this Articles of Confederation may not be able to get the job done. One of the few successes of the Congress of the Confederation during this period, though, was the Northwest Ordinance that was passed in 1787. And this had to do with the fact that some states had western land claims that were really unending. You've got states like Virginia or New York that really did not have a western border. They could theoretically, therefore, continue to expand westward as far as they wanted. Well, that wasn't an issue for those states. It was states like Pennsylvania or Maryland that did not have western land claims. They could not continue to simply enlarge their state or raise money by selling off western lands. And so they felt kind of hemmed in. So this is another case where the states are bickering, they're squabbling amongst one another about this. Fortunately, a peaceful resolution was decided upon. The Northwest Ordinance will decide to cut off the land claims of some of these states and instead carve out the so-called Northwest Territory, what we think of as sort of the Ohio Valley area. And what will happen is, instead of existing states moving westward, no, we're going to have, for the benefit of the common good, we're going to have new states carved out of these western territories. And also, because this is the case, they're going to have to think about, well, how do you move from being a territory to being a formal state within the Union? They're going to go ahead and think through this process and set forth a very logical three-stage process by which territories could kind of move through this application process and achieve certain goals, usually based upon population, to be able to move from being a territory to being formally admitted to the state and the Union. This is crucial because the direction of this young country is westward for the next 100 years. All right, so everybody's moving west. This needs to happen. They need to figure out how these new territories can become states. Eventually, though, enough problems emerge with the Articles of Confederation that serious discussion has to be made about, do we salvage the Articles of Confederation? Do we try to close some of those loopholes within it? Or do we start fresh? The Constitutional Convention will be convened in Philadelphia during the summer of 1787, a meeting of delegates from all the different states, and they're going to have to sit down and ask these questions. Do we keep this first government of the United States, or do we start anew? Ultimately, those delegates will decide that the Articles of Confederation cannot be salvaged. It needs to be thrown in the trash and start with a blank slate. So this is when we have the beginnings of what will become the Constitution of the United States that we know of today.